Whistleblowers and journalists that publish those informations are as inconvenient as the fire alarm in your house. You can switch off the fire alarm for now, and you will feel comfortable for a couple of more moments. But the next time you open your eyes and you wake up and you look around, the whole building will be on fire.
Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. UK courts recently cleared the way for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to be extradited to the United States to face charges over violating the Espionage Act, stemming from WikiLeaks' publication of thousands of leaked documents related to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in 2010. Assange is one of the most controversial figures in the world, with some considering him a brave and heroic journalist, exposing the secrets of the powerful, and some considering him a dangerous criminal or even a terrorist or an asset of Russian intelligence. My guest today knows perhaps more about this case than anyone else and can help us understand some of the legal issues involved. He is Professor Nils Melzer, the Human Rights Chair of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. He's also Professor of International Law at the University of Glasgow and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. He is the author of the new book, The Trial of Julian Assange, A Story of Persecution, available from Verso. Professor Melzer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So I think that one of the interesting things about your book is that you, in the beginning, you discuss the way that you, approaching Julian Assange's case, were dubious at first. You're a human rights expert. Your appointment to the United Nations is to investigate cases of torture. And when the Julian Assange case came across your desk, you were a skeptic that it was even something that you should get involved with, that it was in your purview. And I think some of the feelings that you describe, some of the thoughts that you describe at having this, at seeing this case initially are widely shared. I certainly have had them before too, which is Julian Assange, as I mentioned, is not just controversial, but is seen as, you know, I mean, the legal case against him formally for a while was related to a sex crime investigation. There's all this stuff about, you know, did he help Donald Trump win the election, and so on and so forth. So I want to begin by asking you about that initial skepticism that you had towards his case and what it was that began to turn that skepticism and make you think that the Julian Assange case was, in fact, an important political prosecution that was worth the attention of the United Nations.
Well, yeah, thank you for this question, because I think it's one of the most important ones, certainly as far as my involvement is concerned. When Julian Assange's lawyers first contacted me in December 2018, he was still at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And I distinctly remember working on a report for the United Nations, and you know, this little message came up on the screen, you know, you've got new mail, and the reference line said something like, Julian Assange's lawyers are asking for your protection. And I distinctly remember I had this emotional reaction. Now, you have to know, I received about 10 to 15 requests a day. I can select one that I can actually handle with the resources I have. So it's normal for me to decide quickly every day to do this kind of triage. But I rarely have this kind of emotional reaction. I distinctly remember I had this feeling of, no, I'm not going to let this guy manipulate me. This is this hacker, this rapist, this traitor, you know, the coward hiding out in the embassy, evading justice, and so on. And I kind of just swept it aside, and I forgot about it until his lawyers came back about 3 months later. That was in March 2019, shortly before his expulsion from the embassy, and they said that they were afraid that, you know, there were rumors his expulsion might be imminent, that he might be sent immediately to the US. And what was really important, they sent me a couple of pieces of evidence. They sent me a medical evaluation made by an independent doctor who's not an Assange activist, Dr. Sandra Crosby. Boston University. She's, you know, known to be independent, reliable, an expert in examining torture victims, has visited Guantanamo as an independent doctor. And she actually visited Assange in the embassy, and in her opinion, his living conditions and his state of health were contrary to the Convention Against Torture. Now that struck me as, strange. I couldn't somehow relate to this, but I thought, well, if this kind of expert comes to this conclusion, I better have a look at this. And so I decided to go and visit him in London. I wanted initially to visit him at the embassy, but unfortunately that was not possible, because as soon as I announced I was investigating the case and I asked the British and the Ecuadorian governments to freeze the situation, not to do anything, they did the contrary. Within 3 days, they expelled him from the embassy, and I was then able to visit him in Belmarsh prison. And I took my own medical team with me to, I've visited prisoners for more than 20 years in war areas, for the Red Cross, for the UN. But I still thought it was important here, because this case is so politicized, that I have a very strong medical assessment by 2 independent experts, a forensic and a psychiatrist. And both of them, I didn't expect to find torture, to be quite honest with you. I thought, yeah, let's go there, let's tick the boxes. And probably he has some health problems after 6 years in the embassy, but he's in Britain, it's a rule of law country, he'll get a due process, and he'll get the medical treatment, and that's going to be the end of it. A couple of recommendations and so on. But then both doctors came independently from each other, came to the conclusion that he showed all the symptoms that were typical for a person having been exposed to psychological torture over a prolonged period of time. Now, both experts, again, they do this, they've done this for 30 years. They're not likely to exaggerate. And so he showed all those medical symptoms. And then I thought, well, okay, these are the symptoms, but is this already torture? Let me investigate what could have caused these symptoms, because they're quite dramatic. And so that's what kind of intrigued me, and started my investigation process. I started opening the books, looking at behind the curtains a bit of that, or that surface of this public narrative about him. And as soon as I scratched the surface, I saw that contradictions, came to the light. Contradictions in the public narrative. And the deeper I dug into this case, the more dirt came out on the side of the government, but not on the side of Assange. And so I just realized that virtually nothing that he was accused of in kind of the public sphere was proven. And in fact, that there was even evidence of, the manipulation of evidence, of, collusion between the various authorities of the different countries. And so that really kind of prompted me to look more closely into this case, because I realized there was something deeply wrong with it.
Yeah, and your book lays out all of these findings, the findings about his conditions, the findings about the collusion between governments, about how the cases were constructed. I mean, if people want all of the details as to exactly what happened and the order in which it happened, you've compiled it all here. I do want to get to this question of what gave rise to that conclusion of torture. But first, I think it's worth going back, because I think that in the discussion about WikiLeaks, and you do it also in the book, it is important to first center the disclosures that WikiLeaks made in 2010 that gave rise to Julian Assange's conflict with the United States government and to the British and Swedish government. But so perhaps we could go back to the case that the documents that were leaked that Chelsea Manning passed to Julian Assange, and what was in that, what was exposed that sort of put WikiLeaks on the map. I mean, it's very easy for people to forget this, because it is often shunted aside in the media discourse, that there was sort of evidence of war crimes that were exposed by WikiLeaks.
Yeah, and just to point out that that's precisely the fascinating thing, because that nobody is discussing that anymore. That's precisely what those governments want. So I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the starting point, because that's what gave rise to this whole persecution. Yes, in 2010, WikiLeaks had existed in 2006, and they had, published quite interesting information about, corruption and so on the part of various states, and also, not just the U.S. That's important to mention also, that it's not, an anti-American activist or something, but clearly the U.S. being one of the most powerful countries in the world, or the most powerful country in the world, and engaging in all those foreign operations, has obviously also provided ample material of documents. But yes, those revelations in 2010 started out in April with the so-called collateral murder video, where we see footage from taken from 2 Apache helicopters, attacking unarmed civilians in the streets of Baghdad. You can see that 2 of them might be carrying a light weapon, and but by and large, these are unarmed people who are not engaged in combat, who are being attacked and basically massacred. But the worst thing about this video is that what we can see is that when there are wounded people, even in the law of war, if you're a combatant, you're a soldier, you're a legitimate target. But once you're wounded and you're on the ground and out of combat, it is a war crime to attack you, and even to attack rescuing, units or civilians helping the wounded and so on. And what we see that these types of people were then murdered deliberately by soldiers who were absolutely aware that these were protected persons. And so clearly what we see there is a video documentation of a war crime. And the most shocking thing is that this war crime has never been prosecuted, although we have clear evidence for it. And this was just a starting point. Then in summer 2010, we had I think it was a publication of about 90,000 field reports from the Afghanistan war, the Afghanistan war diary, as it was called. Then later on, I think it was in October, the Iraq war documents. And then in November, the so-called Cablegate publications started with 250,000 diplomatic cables that were sent by US embassies around the world back to Washington. So the correspondence between Washington and those embassies. And those documents reveal clearly very embarrassing material, but also clear evidence for criminal behavior. And I think the most striking thing that's really important for everybody to know is that these crimes have never been disputed. It's not that any of this information is not true. All of it is true. All of this is authentic, but nobody has been prosecuted for those murders and torture cases and so on. That's really important as a starting point. But what has happened, that everybody involved in the publication of those documents, and that involved in the beginning, the New York Times, the Guardian, the El País, the Spiegel, Le Monde, I mean, some of the most important outlets of mainstream media, they have all been involved in this. But who has been prosecuted and I'd say even persecuted for this is Julian Assange, is WikiLeaks, are the whistleblowers that actually provided this evidence for the crimes. And so clearly what we see is a situation where the real criminals are enjoying impunity, while those that actually bring the evidence for crimes, they're being persecuted and intimidated. And that, I think, is really important to keep that in mind as we go through this case. Right. And also that we look at Julian Assange, in this light.
Yeah, because if people go back to the news stories that were published in 2010, as you mentioned, WikiLeaks partnered with a number of mainstream news organizations, including the New York Times and the Guardian. I was just looking back through some of these news stories. A lot of, many crimes were exposed. I mean, you mentioned a few of them, but I mean, it really is, it still has the power to shock. I mean, there's evidence of the United States government shooting hundreds of civilians at checkpoints in Iraq, including pregnant women being rushed to the hospital, where US soldiers would open fire on the car. There's a case where insurgents were trying to surrender and to a helicopter. Then they received advice from the United States military that the insurgents couldn't surrender to a helicopter, so they shot them dead. And I mean, this is just, I mean, you're an international human rights expert, an expert in the law of war. I mean, these are the most gross and blatant violations of the fundamental law of war. And these are things that we would not know about and would never have come to light were it not for the decision of Chelsea Manning to give the documents to WikiLeaks and the decision of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to publish these documents. And I think core to this case that has to be borne in mind is that we have a set of crimes that we would have no way of knowing about because this information is classified, because it was unlawful to disseminate. These would just be secret crimes. I mean, even having been exposed, as you mentioned, they haven't been prosecuted. But there's absolutely no way to hold them accountable. And in fact, you know, one of the fundamental cases against Julian Assange is that he put lives at risk by disclosing the documents. But the opposite is kind of the case, isn't it? Which is that if crimes are not exposed, it creates an incentive for powerful governments to commit more crimes. So it is in fact putting lives at risk to keep information like this secret.
Well, I think, yeah, it's very clear. There's 2 points to be made here. First, as you say, the effect of not insisting on accountability for murder and torture, what it means is that we have murderers, literally, murderers and torturers, you know, walking freely around, you know, in the United States once they return from those war areas, and they have become accustomed, you know, to the fact that they can commit those types of crimes, and they know that their government knows about it because they've seen the evidence, by, you know, published by WikiLeaks and others, and they're not being prosecuted. And I have made the point before, you know, think of the George Floyd murder and, you know, excessive use of force by police. You know, some of these people have been soldiers before. I'm not aware now of the specific case of the officer responsible for George Floyd's murder, but I'm saying it creates a culture in police and military forces because they cooperate, you know, closely, they train each other and so on. It creates a culture of violence and impunity where officials simply assume that they're, you know, entitled to use lethal force, even where there's no justification whatsoever. I don't think it's good for the integrity for any military force, you know, not to prosecute these types of crimes. This is not a question of we against them, you know, or it really is a question of integrity. You know, any military force, the pride of any military force obviously is its strength, but also its integrity. And I've worked with many military forces around the world, and no military force has ever benefited from not prosecuting its own war criminals. And what also needs to be put very clearly, there is no army in the world. You know, the best, you know, leaders cannot prevent some soldiers committing crimes. That's just, you know, wars are extreme situations and war crimes do happen. It's almost inevitably they do happen. But if you don't provide for accountability and you don't insist on, you know, disciplinary and criminal sanctions for war criminals, then you're really letting the ghost out of the bottle, right. You know, and you might, you know, create a problem you can't correct later on. That's one point to be made. The other point really is that this whole narrative of Julian Assange having put people in danger, the US government has been asked in court in the US in the Chelsea Manning trial, but also in London in the current extradition trial to provide evidence you know, of people having been put in danger by those publications. And in both trials, the government had to admit that they did not have any evidence of not a single individual who has actually been put in danger by those publications. I think that's really important. Yeah. That what we're looking at here is a speculative assumption of risk that has not materialized in any harm, while on the other hand, we have people being massacred on screen, right. And there is nobody, right. There's nobody being prosecuted. for it.
Even if the leaks had put lives in danger, you'd have to weigh the benefits of exposing the crimes versus the risk. But what is interesting in this case is that it wasn't for want of trying. I mean, the United States government tried very hard to link particular deaths to these disclosures and was totally unable to do it. And in fact, there's evidence that they were privately admitting that their public line on this was false. They maintained over and over that lives were being put in danger, but knew, even as various government officials were saying this, that there was no evidence to back that up.
I think our reaction to this type of material, a breach of federal law, is always the same, and that is whenever you have the potential for names and for operations and for programs to be out there in the public domain, that it, besides being against the law, has a potential to be very harmful to those that are in our military, those that are cooperating with our military, and those that are working to keep us safe.
And there's one more point, Nathan, that's really important to stress here, that when we're talking about unredacted files, we're mainly referring to the cables, the diplomatic cables, because the Iraq and the Afghanistan documents have been very carefully redacted by WikiLeaks and its partners. The same happened with the diplomatic cables, but then in the process, when this publication was going on, two Guardian journalists, not WikiLeaks and not Assange, published a book where they published a password to the unredacted file that was stored somewhere, had been mirrored somewhere on the internet, and was out of the control of WikiLeaks. And they actually provided public access to the unredacted files. And only after that had happened did Assange decide to also publish the complete file unredacted. But so he actually only republished it. He was not the first to do that. And those that actually did have never been held to account for that.
Yeah, because one of the allegations that is made is that, unlike a journalist, Julian Assange just indiscriminately dumped large piles of internal documents related to the Iraq and Afghanistan war onto the internet without going through a process to check whether these leaks would endanger anyone. But in fact, as you say, the Iraq and Afghanistan documents, they worked closely with major newspapers to do exactly that. And so this is really just false.
There's even evidence. I mean, I've even heard, witness testimonies of people that were actually involved in the process at the time on the part of those major newspapers, who said that Assange was the one who insisted on redactions when those partners were prepared to actually go ahead with much, less safety. I think that's important. And we also have a voice recording of Julian Assange calling the White House and warning them that those Cablegate, documents would become publicly accessible by the actions of others, those Guardian journalists and the journal The Freitag, and that he could not control this, but that he was warning them and prepared to work with the US authorities to do damage control. He was the one who called, none of the publication partners. I think that's really important, that this is really something that is widely, is not even known.
Oh, hello, can I please speak to Hillary Clinton? I'm calling from the office of Julian Assange. It's very important. All of the US Department of State cables, we have intelligence that they are about to be put on the web, unredacted, not by us. And I would like to speak to her about this.
Just put him on. Who is he?
Okay.
Who is he?
Hello. G'day, Chad. This is Julian Assange. To try and to make it clear, we don't have a problem. You have a problem.
Now, I think that many people hearing about these leaks might say, well, but don't governments have a right to keep certain things secret, and don't they need a system of classification, and when people violate that, don't they need to be punished? But you draw an interesting distinction in the book between confidentiality and secrecy, and you point out that yes, in fact, government agencies do need to keep certain things confidential, but there needs to be an internal process of accountability where we make sure that nothing is being insulated from review and that things slip into secrecy when you have the wings of the government that are able to operate completely without any ability to find out what they're doing. And when you have those kinds of secrecy develop, then there really is no option but to have someone who is inside, who sees some kind of wrongdoing occur, leak the document publicly, because you don't have a process.
Right. I think, to anybody, it should be absolutely obvious that when we're speaking of democracy, when we're speaking of the rule of law, it means that all government power is subject to the law. But that also means that it has to be reviewable by the judiciary, you see, and it means that misconduct has to be able, you have to be able to bring that to at least a court so they can actually deal with it. And the problem with secrecy really is that what it does, it withdraws the evidence for misconduct from the legal, overview, from legal review, from the rule of law, and it creates, in that sense, a lawless space, where government officials can do, as they please with impunity, and that simply is not a good idea. It's we know since biblical times, that human beings are simply not designed to work without some form of supervision. We start abusing our power. I think we don't have to be as dramatic as assuming everybody is a criminal, but it's just a very bad idea to give someone power, without supervision. And that's really, I think it's a basic, truth that we simply have to recognize, that when we give our secret services the privilege to classify, or the government the privilege to classify any information they want to classify, and then to make it punishable, to publish it, even where there is a public interest in knowing evidence for criminal conduct, what we're doing essentially is that, we're providing accused criminals in a court, people accused of a serious crime in court, the power to classify the evidence against them. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Obviously, they will be classifying evidence that is bad for them. So this is a very bad idea. And we've come up, with the separation of powers, with the rule of law, and with democracy 250 years ago for a reason. And we really have to be careful not to recreate the same problem now based on kind of flimsy arguments of national security. What's in national security interest in hiding the identity of war criminals from the public? There is no national security interest in that. Its only interest that's in there is the interest of the criminal in impunity. And I think there we really have to be careful. So you're absolutely right. Confidentiality, yes, it must be. I've worked for the Red Cross for 12 years in war areas. Our reports were confidential. It was very important to have a protected space to negotiate and so on. But that does not mean that my conduct as a Red Cross official, was withdrawn from legal supervision. I was not free to commit crimes with impunity.
Do you think it is accurate to say that Julian Assange's conduct violated United States law, but did so out of necessity because United States law criminalizes conduct that is essential to holding the United States government accountable? Or do you think the argument is that Julian Assange did not, in fact, violate the Espionage Act?
Well, I think he didn't. I mean, the Espionage Act is it's an old piece of legislation from the First World War, and its point was, to criminalize, traitors that were basically collaborating with the enemy. I mean, what Julian Assange did has nothing to do with that. He had no duty of allegiance towards the United States. He's not an American. He was not in the United States. He's Australian. He published true information that he didn't steal. He didn't hack. There is no evidence whatsoever for that. Information he received from whistleblowers as a publisher, he published it because he considered there was public interest in knowing about that. Yes, there are attempts by the US government to interpret the Espionage Act as criminalizing this behavior. But I have to point out that Julian Assange is the first journalist, first publisher who's actually being prosecuted under that act. And as everybody knows in the US Constitution has a First Amendment that protects press freedom and the freedom of expression. And so that would be a justification. The problem with the Espionage Act is that it does not allow a public interest defense. So this is really a absolutely key case that would change the legal landscape in the US. It's a precedent. If the government succeeds in criminalizing what Julian Assange has done, essentially what the New York Times have done, what the Washington Post have done, the Guardian, everybody else has become a crime. And so it is a warning to people like you, Nathan. If I give you a USB stick with the collateral murder video #2 and the next 250,000 diplomatic cables, and just to assure you, I don't have one, but if I had one, would you publish it? 10 years ago, maybe yes, but today you would look at Julian Assange and say, well, this is the precedent, I'm not going to do it.
Yes,
and that's the scary effect.
Right. As you're weighing the calculus, I mean, even if you're a journalist committed to the public interest, you have to be aware that by publishing this information, you may be throwing the rest of your life away. So you might be thrown in a United States supermax prison for the rest of your life. So the point that you're making here is that the answer to the question is, well, the Espionage Act is incredibly broad. I mean, if it is found that he violated it, then that might become United States law, that in fact what he did was a crime. But that would essentially make the First Amendment's guarantee of press freedom null and void in a very important way. And there is no logical distinction between the actions that he took and the actions that many newspapers take, which essentially would mean that if this is a crime under United States law, then basic acts of journalism are a crime, which is extremely concerning.
Yeah, it's the end of press freedom. And quite frankly, you're no longer allowed to expose serious crimes and corruption committed by your government because your government has the power to classify. And we all know that there is a notorious problem of overclassification. And there's no reason for classifying evidence for crimes. In fact, there should be a duty to publish those types of documents. But so you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a critical moment in the history of the United States. This is not about whether you like Assange as a person or not. And he's not being prosecuted for not being likable. He's being prosecuted for having published true information about serious misconduct of the US government. That's what he's being prosecuted for. And do you want people to be prosecuted because they publish true information for about serious misconduct of the US government? I don't think that the US population would be interested in this type of situation. It would really bring us back to an absolutist kind of dictatorial type of government system.
And it's interesting that the element of Julian Assange not being a United States citizen, being an Australian, because the other half of it is that this does not just mean that the United States can dictate to its own people what they are allowed to say, but it means the United States has this reach around the world where anyone who publishes embarrassing information about the US that we have deemed that we don't want people to know can essentially, if there's an extradition treaty, can be kidnapped, brought here and put on trial. And other countries can't do that, right? I mean, if other countries said to the United States, well, we have decided that your citizens have embarrassed us, we'd like you to send them here so we can prosecute them and put them in prison.
Yeah. China, they could say, your journalists violated our secrecy laws. Please extradite him. Or Saudi Arabia, we know how they deal with journalists. And so I think really we have to be very serious about it. What is this about? It's about criminalizing journalism. And this does not mean you have to like Julian Assange. Now, I don't think there is a reason to dislike him, but you know, that's not the issue here. But what we can see is that governments have pursued very successfully this kind of classic way of demonizing the person to detract from what this is really about. You know, so we're all discussing Julian Assange, and is he likable? Is he not? Is he a narcissist? Is he not? Did he feed his cat? Did he skateboard in the embassy? Did he, you know, commit rape? Did he, you know, all of these things that we're discussing kind of detract from what this is really about, because it's not about him. It's about the governments.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've mentioned there the most serious, I think, actual allegation that was brought up in this discussion, which is the allegation of sexual misconduct, which I think is substantively different from from a lot of the silly stuff.
It's not trivial. It's not trivial.
I do think that it is a separate question from the question that we face right now. I mean, because the Swedish investigation over sexual misconduct was ultimately dropped with no indictment or charge, the only question right now legally with Julian Assange, is this correct, is whether he violated United States law in publishing these documents, and this is what he now faces the possibility of punishment for.
Absolutely, and I just want to point out, you're absolutely right. The Swedish allegations were dropped by the Swedish authorities themselves, and it's very important to point out it's not because the charges somehow expired, you know, that the time ran out, or that they didn't have the possibility to question and extradite him. They dropped those charges, or those allegations rather, at a point in time when he was in British hands, in the British prison, and he could have been, you know, surrendered to Sweden anytime. They could have come to question him in London anytime in that prison. He was at the disposal of the Swedish government, and they basically said, we're dropping these charges because we don't have enough evidence, not to convict him, but not even to charge him of any crime whatsoever. And I think that's really important that this is made clear.
Right.
And I think if the prosecutor, after 9 years of investigation, comes to that conclusion, then we really all have to, you know, assume there's a presumption of innocence.
So is it right that there was never an indictment? There was never, I don't know quite how Swedish law works, but he was never charged with a sexual offense in Sweden.
No.
And over the course of that time, it was very weird, right? So this is, unfortunately, it created sort of a complicated legal situation because, you know, he was, the issue was ostensibly whether he'd been extradited to Sweden over questioning over this one case, but actually the reason he was in the embassy was because he didn't want to be sent to the United States for prosecution over the leaking. I was a little confused about the Swedish case because, as I understand it, for the sort of 9 years that they were supposedly, was it 9 years? A long time that they were sort of investigating this. They said that they wanted to question. I don't quite understand what the status of that case was during that time, because I mean, here in the United States, at least, you have a right against self-incrimination. And if a prosecutor says, we'd like to question you over this case, and you say no, then they have to build the evidence against you. And if they can't come up with enough evidence against you, they can't charge you. Well, why was this case in this kind of limbo for 9 years?
Yeah. Well, you see, I think it's quite obvious when you see what the Swedish really wanted. They didn't have enough evidence to start with. And that's quite obvious for any experienced investigator. If you look at those allegations, and you know, we don't have to go into the details, but just to a very quick summary, in one case, the question was whether Julian Assange had, in a voluntary sexual encounter with a woman on both sides, whether he had intentionally destroyed a condom or whether it had been destroyed by accident. Now that's something, you know, the woman hasn't seen it. She just presumed it was intentional, but it could have been an accident. And now this is something forensically if he doesn't confess, there is no way of proving that, and any prosecutor knows that.
This has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You can't prove it beyond. It's just technically not possible to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And he has no criminal history for sexual offenses at all at an age of 40 at the time, and he didn't. He basically denied this allegation. So there's no way to prove that. The other case, very similar. The allegation was, so there was this voluntary encounter with this woman. They fall asleep in the morning, and then she wakes up, she says, because he kind of approaches her again, and without a condom. And now he says, no, she was awake and she agreed. And so now, again, I don't know what really happened, but no one will ever know. And the prosecutors knew exactly. There is no way of proving that. Mm-hmm. So this is the starting point. And now in Swedish law, it's important there is a phase in the criminal investigation that's called preliminary investigation, where the prosecutor is collecting evidence and hearing the suspect and witnesses, but is not obliged to disclose any evidence until she actually presses charges against him. Now, as soon as she presses charges, she has to actually disclose the evidence. And because there has not been any evidence, as we know today, otherwise they wouldn't have dropped the allegations for lack of evidence, she wanted to avoid getting to the point where she has to disclose the evidence. So as long as he was in Sweden and he prolonged his stay for 5 weeks, and he asked repeatedly to be heard by the prosecutor, and she refused to actually to interrogate him. Yeah. Because as soon as she interrogates him, she now has to decide whether she has sufficient evidence to press charges or not. And so she has to disclose the evidence. So she wanted to avoid that. And therefore, as long as he was in Sweden, she refused to hear him. He asked, well, okay, if you don't want to interview me, can I leave Sweden? And she confirmed that he can leave. And then the day he left, she issued an arrest warrant because he wanted to evade justice. She accused him of that. And so he offered to come back, but now he said, look, something is wrong here. I want a guarantee that the point of this is not to send me to the US, is it? Right? Because the Swedes had handed over people to the CIA without legal proceedings before. Yes. And so he just wanted a guarantee, and they said, oh, we can't guarantee that. Mm-hmm. And so he said, well, okay, then I'm not coming, but you can interview me in London, or you can, interview me through the phone or video link, as has been done in many other proceedings between the UK and Sweden. And the Swedish prosecutor, again, refused that, because as soon as she hears him, she now has to disclose her evidence and drop the case because she doesn't have evidence. So she kind of played that game of, he doesn't want to come to Sweden, and we don't give him a guarantee because otherwise he would come and we would question. So she wanted to avoid that questioning. And with this, she could maintain those allegations without any evidence for 9 years. And at that final point, when he was in the hands of the British and the US had asked for extradition, that rape allegation was no longer necessary. And so they could basically drop it.
Well, I think it's worth, I would have a slightly different interpretation of no evidence, because I think the testimony of the accusers is a kind of evidence. But I think what is important is that this is not about whether you believe or disbelieve those who made allegations against Julian Assange, because we can perfectly well believe their accounts and still believe that there is insufficient evidence to make out a charge, which there was, because the Swedish prosecutor didn't bring a charge, and to secure a conviction, which obviously are also. Yes,
and you're right to point that out. And if I say no evidence, I mean not sufficient evidence for pressing charges. Clearly, there are statements made by the women. Although I think it's also important to point out that there is very important evidence in terms of text messages sent by the women at the time when they went to the police station, proving that they did not have the intention to accuse him of any crime. That's not the concern they had. What they were concerned about is that they could have contracted HIV, and they wanted him to take a test. And that they actually were very upset when the police decided to create start a investigation for rape against him. And so that's evidence that has been suppressed largely by the Swedes. And because I do speak Swedish, I was able to read those files and bring some of this to light. But you're absolutely right. Technically, we can say we don't know what happened. And what we simply have to acknowledge is that a professional investigative service of the Swedish prosecution service in 9 years has not been able to collect enough evidence to even press charges. And with this, I don't think it's up to us to start speculating about what happened.
I think what's one of the important things here is that it is a completely separate question from the question of, as you say, the serious threat to press freedom that comes from the United States prosecution. And I think one of the things that you do lay out, the way it is linked, though, is that you do lay out a compelling case in the book that he was correct to believe that if he left the embassy at any point, it would result in his extradition to the United States to face charges over the leaks. Because the Swedish government wouldn't offer guarantees that he wasn't going to be extradited, you also, you point to evidence of collusion between the UK government and the United States government, UK government, the Swedish government, right? That there was this public pretense that this was all about trying to get him to answer for an offense committed in Sweden that ultimately he was not charged for. And people can even believe that they can believe whatever you believe about the facts of what happened in Sweden. It is nevertheless the case that this was a pretext, and that the reality was that if Julian Assange had not been in the Ecuadorian embassy, which they said, oh, he's free to leave at any time. His theory was, the moment I set foot outside this embassy, this Swedish thing will probably end up being dropped, which ultimately it was, but he would lose all of the protection that was keeping him from being prosecuted by the United States.
Right. Yeah, he was available to the Swedish prosecutor and they decided not to prosecute him. That's the end of the story. That's the end of the story. That story is finished, in all dimensions. And we don't even, that we'll never know what really happened, but the prosecutor decided that they're going to drop the case, although that he was at their disposal. So you're absolutely right. The only thing that this is about today is whether he should and could be extradited to the US for his publication activities. And here, there's also a point that is important to make. He is charged under the Espionage Act. Espionage is the quintessential political offense. And the UK-US extradition treaty explicitly prohibits extraditions for political offenses. So, it's not even possible technically to, even if he has violated the Espionage Act, he can't be extradited for that under the treaty.
The reason that I just wanted to ask you about this being the reason why he had to be in the embassy for so many years is because I just want to finish by returning to where we started, which is your conclusion that it is warranted to invoke the word torture in the discussion of what Julian Assange went through over the course of that period, right? It is essential to your conclusion that Julian Assange effectively could not leave, right? Those who say that he could leave and all he had to do was go to Sweden and answer some questions. He could not leave because if he left, what would have happened was what is happening now, which is that the United States government will come after him aggressively. So because he was effectively imprisoned in the Ecuadorian embassy as a sort of an asylum seeker, as someone who's surrounded by a pool of sharks, I think you said before. Because of that, evaluating his conditions becomes a matter of evaluating the conditions of confinement, and when you evaluate those conditions of confinement, what it was like to spend that long in solitary in the embassy, that's where you gave what is your kind of strongest and most controversial conclusion, which is that he shows evidence of having been tortured. So perhaps you could say now what you feel justifies that conclusion.
Absolutely. I think, the argument that he's free to leave the embassy, I mean, you're absolutely right. You almost quoted me there that Jeremy Hunt, at the time, the Foreign Secretary of the UK, reacted to my assessment on Twitter, saying that Julian Assange was free to leave the embassy at any time. And I responded in a tweet saying, that with all due respect, he was about as free to leave the embassy as someone sitting on a rubber boat in a shark pool. And I think that image is important because anyone who's enjoying political asylum is free to leave. The people that fled to the US embassy in Beijing after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, they were free to leave. The people that were hiding, from the Holocaust in those apartments in the Netherlands or, Germany, and, the Jews that were hiding there, they were free to leave. But it's an absurd argument to say that they're free to leave. I mean, anyone hiding is voluntarily hiding, not because obviously he wants to be. The question is not whether he wants to hide. The question is what happens to him or her when the person leaves the hiding place, the place of asylum. And that's, something where he was always told that he's paranoid, and that paranoid, and that he will, that Obama had decided not to prosecute him. But lo and behold, when he actually, in 2010, he wanted to come to Switzerland, to get established in Switzerland, the US ambassador in Switzerland warned the Swiss government not to give him asylum. So if you don't want to prosecute him as the US, if the only thing that he's accused of at the time were the Swedish allegations, why would the US ambassador warn Switzerland not to give him asylum? So clearly, the US was behind him all the time that he was in the embassy and was after him and was waiting for him to come out of the embassy.
Which we now see, right? I mean, it's just been proven by the fact that it happened.
Yes, and we also know that already before Trump, that was the case. You see, that's also important. But so what? How do I come to the assessment of torture? Well, the medical symptoms are simply medical symptoms. They're scientifically established, neurological impairments, cognitive impairments that point to extreme levels of anxiety and stress, and that are far beyond what a normal kind of standard prisoner would experience. So that's the medical assessment. And now, what could have caused this? Well, he was exposed to very few kind of influencing factors for about 6 years, while he was more than 6 years than he was in the embassy. And what we can see is how his living conditions changed. That when I speak of psychological torture is important to understand, is not a kind of a lighter, softer form of torture. It's actually, in many respects, more cruel even than physical torture, because it aims directly at the personality of the person, and it combines elements of danger, like the constant threat scenario of being extradited to a country where he's not going to get a fair trial, and he might end up being buried alive in a supermax prison for the rest of his life. That's the threat scenario. And then he's being isolated. The person is isolated from friendly factors and environments. So you have him under complete control. You have him under threat. Then you start also creating an arbitrary environment where the rules that you want to invoke of the law and of human rights and so no longer apply. That it applies for everybody else, but not for you. Press freedom applies for the New York Times, but not for Julian Assange. Due process applies for everybody else, but not for Julian Assange. All these types of things. So the arbitrariness of the environment, which destabilizes the person additionally, and then finally you add the level of stress through humiliation, defamation, and so on, that destroys the self-respect of the person. And aims to really destabilize the personality. It all sounds not that bad, but these are the elements that you have in mobbing situations, for example, that people may be familiar with from school, the workplace, the military, and so on. And we know that mobbing can push people to commit suicide in very short periods of time. because it's a very cruel form of mistreatment to exclude someone from society and to destroy them deliberately. And with him, we could really see those effects. Clearly, when we visited him on the 9th of May, 2019, both doctors said that his state of health was critical, in a critical condition, and that he was likely to enter a downward spiral quickly if the constant pressure of his isolation, and arbitrary persecution was not relieved soon. And that's what happened. 9 days after our visit, he actually was transferred to the medical division because he was no longer able to participate in court hearings. He had constant thoughts of suicide. And so they put him on suicide watch and on complete isolation for many months, where, obviously this exacerbated his medical condition to the point where he was confused during court hearings, could not state his name anymore properly. And so that was really a very, very bad period. And clearly his health will not improve, put in a high security prison. What for? I mean, he's not violent. He's in a category A, the toughest supermax prison in the UK, the so-called Guantanamo of Britain. But he's non-violent. He's not serving a sentence. He's only being detained for purposes of extradition. And he's more than 2 years in this solitary confinement. We have to know that according to the UN standards that states have agreed on, prolonged solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days are considered cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Now, with him, it's months on end, years,
right.
And he doesn't have enough access to his lawyers to prepare his defense. And just to make absolutely clear, there is no legal basis in the UK to hold him in a high security prison, because the only legitimate purpose of his detention is to ensure his presence in case he should be extradited at the end of this proceeding. But this can be done through house arrest, as would have been done, for example, with Augusto Pinochet.
Well, of course, the same was done to Chelsea Manning. Was a lot of use of solitary confinement, and it is important, even thinking about the embassy phase, to remember that going outside is sort of a fundamental right and a thing that helps human beings stay sane. Being confined in a small space for many years, it's not about how it sounds, it's about how it feels. And if people actually think about what that would really be like, you also document in the book that U.S. officials and journalists were sort of openly calling for him to be killed. I mean, people pretty open about the fact that they think of him as a terrorist. They, wish a drone strike would take him out, that sort of thing. So, I mean, the effort to portray him as a sort of enemy of the state who has to be destroyed has just been so aggressive.
The way to deal with this is pretty simple. We got special ops forces. I mean, a dead man can't leak stuff. This guy's a traitor, a treasonous, and he has broken every law of the United States. The guy ought to be. And I'm not for the death penalty, so if I'm not for the death penalty, the only one to do it, illegally shoot the son of a.
Well, what about it?
Did you ever joke about droning us on?
Well, I don't know anything about what he's talking about, and I don't recall any joke.
Professor Melzer, thank you so much for going through this this case so carefully with me and laying out all of the facts. If people want more, your book is coming out soon. It is The Trial of Julian Assange, available from Verso Books. There you go. I got it. You've got it.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, you got it too.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you.